The Shadow Behind the Archway, The Mind and Madness of Mark David Chapman. Act 1, The Echo of a Genesis. On the evening of December 8, 1980, the autumn chill of New York City carried a sharp, damp bite. Outside the Dakota apartment building on the corner of 72nd Street and Central Park West, the street lamps cast an amber glow over the stone archway. It was an imposing structure, built like a Renaissance fortress, designed to keep the world out. But on this night, the world, in its most twisted form, was waiting just beyond the gates. Mark David Chapman stood in the shadows. He was 25 years old, pudgy, wearing a heavy coat, and carrying a quiet storm inside his skull. In his pocket rested a Charter Arms .38 caliber revolver loaded with 5 hollow-point bullets, ammunition specifically designed to expand upon impact, tearing through flesh and bone to ensure maximum destruction. In his hands, he clutched a copy of J.D. Salinger's masterpiece, The Catcher in the Rye. Inside the cover, he had recently written a new inscription, "This is my statement, Holden Caulfield." To the passers-by and the dedicated fans who regularly loitered outside the Dakota, Chapman looked like just another harmless devotee waiting for a glimpse of rock and roll royalty. But Chapman was not there to worship. He was there to execute. He was there to steal a legacy, and in doing so, anchor his own nameless existence to an immortal icon. He was waiting for John Lennon. To understand how a former camp counselor, born-again Christian, and security guard from Decatur, Georgia, ended up under that Manhattan archway with blood on his mind, one must peel back the layers of a decades-long psychological deterioration. Chapman's journey to the Dakota was not a sudden fracture of reality. It was a slow, agonizing erosion, a life built on a foundation of intense insecurity, shifting obsessions, and a devastating inability to find a place in the world. The Boy in the Defensive Wall. Mark David Chapman's story began on May 10, 1955, in Fort Worth, Texas. He was the son of David Chapman, a staff sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, and Rebecca Chapman, a nurse. From the outside, the family appeared to embody the post-war American dream, eventually relocating to a comfortable suburban home in Decatur, Georgia. Inside the home, however, the atmosphere was thick with tension and fear. David Chapman was a cold, emotionally detached man. He showed little affection for his son and, according to Mark's later accounts, frequently subjected Rebecca to physical and verbal abuse. Young Mark grew up in the suffocating shadow of this domestic instability. Terrified of his father and unable to find solace in his mother, he retreated deeply into his own imagination. By the age of 9, Chapman had created an elaborate secret world to escape the shouting matches that echoed through his home. He imagined a colony of little people who lived inside the walls of his bedroom. In this imaginary kingdom, Mark was not a helpless, frightened boy. He was their king, their absolute ruler, and their savior. He set up a complex society for them, complete with a tiny stage where he would perform for them, playing his guitar or spinning records. If he was happy, the little people thrived. If he was angry or felt slighted by the real world, he would unleash imaginary catastrophes upon them, demanding their total submission and worship. This childhood coping mechanism revealed an early, dangerous psychological trait, a profound need for absolute control and an intense craving for significance. When the real world denied him power, Chapman manufactured it. The Metamorphosis of a Seeker. As Chapman entered adolescence in the late 1960s, the real world began to intrude upon his kingdom in the walls. Like millions of other teenagers of his generation, he discovered rock music, and more specifically, the Beatles. For a time, Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr were the soundtrack to his escape. He learned to play the guitar, grew his hair long, and experimented with drugs, including LSD and marijuana. However, Chapman's personality was inherently volatile, swinging like a pendulum between extreme devotion and bitter resentment. In 1971, at the age of 16, he experienced a dramatic radicalization. After attending a revival meeting led by an evangelical youth group, Chapman threw away his drugs, cut his hair, and became a fiercely zealous, born-again Christian. He didn't just adopt the faith, he consumed it. He wore a heavy wooden cross around his neck and carried a Bible everywhere he went. He began working for the YMCA, discovering a genuine talent for counseling children. In the summer of 1975, His dedication earned him a spot in a YMCA international program, traveling to Beirut, Lebanon, to assist refugees amidst the early, perilous days of the Lebanese Civil War. For the first time in his life, Chapman felt a sense of purpose. He was respected, liked, and validated. He returned to the United States, convinced that he was destined for greatness within the Christian humanitarian community. But this brief period of stability was fragile, built on the shifting sands of an ego that required constant, external praise to stay afloat. When he enrolled at Covenant College, a strict Presbyterian institution in Lookout Mountain, Georgia, the illusion shattered. The academic rigor overwhelmed him. He fell deeply in love with a young woman, but the relationship collapsed under the weight of his intense, smothering insecurity. Plagued by guilt over his perceived failures and sexual desires, which clashed violently with his rigid religious beliefs, Chapman experienced a profound psychological breakdown. He dropped out of college, walked away from his YMCA career, and plunged into a dark, paralyzing depression. The little people inside his walls, who had been quiet during his years of religious fervor, began to whisper once more. But this time, they weren't singing praises to their king. They were demanding blood. Act 2, The Anatomy of an Obsession. By 1977, Chapman was a man adrift, fleeing the wreckage of his life in Georgia. He chose to run as far as he could within the American paradigm, relocating to Honolulu, Hawaii. He arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a mind rapidly unspooling. In Hawaii, the depression hardened into despair. Chapman felt completely invisible, a non-entity moving through a paradise that belonged to everyone else. In June of that year, unable to cope with the silence in his head, he attempted suicide. He drove to a deserted beach, ran a vacuum cleaner hose from his car's exhaust pipe into the window, and sat inside, waiting for the carbon monoxide to take him. The attempt failed only because the plastic hose melted in the Hawaiian heat, breaking the seal and allowing oxygen to flow back into the vehicle. A passerby discovered the semi-conscious Chapman and intervened. Instead of being institutionalized, Chapman was admitted to Castle Memorial Hospital's psychiatric wing. There, a strange irony occurred. His time as a patient went so well that the hospital staff, recognizing his past experience with the YMCA, offered him a job upon his release. For a short time, Chapman appeared to stabilize. He worked as a maintenance man and later as a print shop operator. In 1979, he married Gloria Abe, a quiet, gentle Japanese-American travel agent who had helped him plan his post-recovery trips. To the casual observer, David Chapman had achieved a quiet, domestic normalcy. He had a wife, a job, and a home. But beneath the surface, a lethal cocktail of resentment, envy, and madness was beginning to brew. The catalyst for this final, irreversible descent was a convergence of two distinct media, a book and a record. The Book of Lies. It was during this period of superficial stability in Hawaii that Chapman walked into a library and picked up a copy of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. The novel, narrated by the cynical, disillusioned teenager Holden Caulfield, acted as an immediate, violent lightning rod for Chapman's fractured psyche. Holden Caulfield's central crusade throughout the novel is against phoniness. He views the adult world as a corrupt, dishonest masquerade where genuine innocence is systematically hunted down and destroyed. For Chapman, this wasn't just fiction, it was a divine revelation. He didn't just relate to Holden Caulfield, he became him. He looked at his own life, his mundane job, his unglamorous marriage, his failed ambitions, and concluded that he was surrounded by phonies. More importantly, he felt that he himself had become a phony by settling for an ordinary life. Chapman began to read the book obsessively, over and over, until the text became an internal monologue. He adopted Holden's mannerisms, his speech patterns, and his deep-seated hatred for those who achieved wealth, fame, and status without possessing what Chapman deemed true authenticity. And then his eyes turned toward John Lennon, the god who failed. To understand why John Lennon became the ultimate target of Chapman's rage, one must understand the unique place Lennon held in the cultural landscape of the late 1970s. Lennon had spent the last 5 years of the decade completely withdrawn from the public eye. He was living as a self-described house husband in the luxurious Dakota apartments, raising his young son Sean, baking bread, and managing a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio alongside his wife, Yoko Ono. In the summer of 1980, Lennon broke his silence. He announced his return to music with the album Double Fantasy, a collaborative record with Ono that celebrated domestic bliss, maturity, peace, and the simple joys of family life. The promotional interviews featured Lennon speaking candidly about his wealth, his happiness, and his optimism for the future. To mark David Chapman, sitting in his small, sweltering apartment in Honolulu, Lennon's new public persona was a personal insult. Years earlier, as a teenager, Chapman had worshipped Lennon. He had listened to the Beatles' songs of peace, love, and anti-materialism. He remembered the lyrics to Imagine, Imagine no possessions, I wonder if you can. He remembered the lyrics to God, God is a concept by which we measure our pain. I don't believe in Beatles, I just believe in me. Now Chapman looked at the reality of John Lennon's life. Lennon was a billionaire. He owned multiple apartments in the Dakota, one of the most exclusive buildings in New York. He owned dairy farms, yachts, and millions of dollars in art. He lived a life of ultimate luxury while preaching peace and poverty to the masses. The fusion of the Catcher in the Rye and John Lennon's wealth created a toxic explosion in Chapman's mind. Lennon became the ultimate phony. Chapman's anger wasn't just political or social, it was intensely personal, fueled by a profound, pathological envy. He looked at Lennon's happiness and compared it to his own emptiness. He felt that Lennon had lied to him, had betrayed the ideals of a generation, and was laughing at the world from his fortress on Central Park West. In his later confessions, Chapman explained the twisted logic that took hold of him. He told us to imagine no possessions, and there he was, with millions of dollars and yachts and farms and posh estates, laughing at people like me who had believed the lies and bought the records and built our lives around his songs. The voices of the little people inside his head returned with a vengeance. They no longer asked for songs. They told him that by killing John Lennon, he would accomplish two monumental things. He would expose the world's greatest phony, and he would forever cease to be a nobody. By destroying the icon, he would absorb the icon's fame. He would become the Catcher in the Rye. Act 3. The Architecture of an Execution. Once the decision was made, Chapman approached the task with a chilling, methodical focus. The chaotic, drifting loser disappeared, replaced by an efficient assassin. In late October 1980, Chapman resigned from his job as a security guard at the Hawaiian Monarch condominium complex. On his final day, he signed out of the logbook not with his own name, but by writing John Lennon. He then went to a local gun shop and purchased a 5-shot Charter Arms .38 special revolver for $169. Because Hawaii had strict laws regarding firearm registration, he was able to buy the weapon legally but could not easily obtain the ammunition he wanted without raising suspicion. To fund his deadly expedition, Chapman sold a valuable lithograph by the artist Norman Rockwell, a prized possession his wife had bought for him. He took the money, lied to Gloria, telling her he was going to New York to clear his head, write a book, and find himself, and bought a one-way ticket to the mainland. The First Pilgrimage. Chapman arrived in New York City on October 30, 1980. He checked into the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a choice that reflected his growing delusion of grandeur. He was a man on a historic mission, and he believed he deserved luxury. However, his immediate problem was ammunition. Under New York law, he could not legally buy bullets. Unfazed, Chapman took a train to Atlanta, Georgia, to visit an old friend who was a police officer. He lied to his friend, claiming he needed ammunition for protection while staying in a dangerous neighborhood in New York. The officer, unsuspecting, gave him 5 hollow-point bullets. Chapman returned to New York, the lethal puzzle pieces now fully assembled. He began stalking the Dakota. He stood outside the gates for hours, watching the residents come and go, learning the rhythm of the building. He even spoke to the doormen and some of the fans who gathered regularly. Yet during this first trip, something unexpected happened. The human element briefly pierced his delusion. While watching the movie Ordinary People in a Times Square theater, Chapman found himself weeping uncontrollably. The film's themes of family tragedy, guilt, and emotional alienation struck a deep chord. Later that night, he called his wife Gloria in Hawaii. He confessed to her that he had come to New York with the intention of killing John Lennon, but claimed that her love had saved him, that the obsession had broken. He returned to Honolulu on November 12. For a brief moment, it appeared the tragedy had been averted, but the darkness in Chapman's mind was not cured, it was merely gathering strength. The final departure. The peace lasted less than 3 weeks. By early December, the whispers returned, louder and more demanding than before. The release of Double Fantasy was dominating the airwaves. Everywhere Chapman went, he heard Lennon's voice. The contrast between Lennon's triumphant return and his own miserable, anonymous existence became unbearable. On December 5, 1980, Chapman packed his bags for the final time. He left his apartment in Honolulu, leaving behind a carefully arranged collection of personal items on his dresser, his passport, his Bible open to the Gospel of John, and a small cassette tape on which he had recorded a message to his wife. He arrived in New York later that day. This time, he didn't stay at the Waldorf Astoria. He checked into the West Side YMCA on 63rd Street, just a few blocks from the Dakota, before later moving to the Olcott Hotel on West 72nd Street. For 3 days, Chapman became a permanent fixture on the sidewalk outside the Dakota. He was a ghost waiting for a body. He carried his revolver in his coat pocket, his fingers constantly brushing against the cold steel. In his other hand, he held the catcher in the rye, using it as both a shield and a manifesto. During these days of waiting, Chapman had several bizarre, mundane interactions that highlighted the terrifying duality of his state of mind. He spoke politely to the Dakota's doorman, Jose Perdomo. He chatted with a young photographer named Paul Gauche, who frequently snapped photos of Lennon and the fans. Chapman even met Lennon's 5-year-old son, Sean, who was returning home from a walk with his nanny, Helen Seaman. Chapman stepped forward, touched the little boy's hand, and whispered, "You're a beautiful boy." Even as he looked into the eyes of the child, whose father he intended to slaughter, Chapman felt no hesitation. The humanity of the Lennon family was irrelevant to him. They were characters in a play that he had written, and the final act had to be performed. Act 4, 5 shots on 72nd Street. The morning of Monday, December 8, 1980, rose cold and clear over Manhattan. Mark David Chapman left his room at the Olcott Hotel early. He spent the morning purchasing a new copy of The Catcher in the Rye from a nearby bookstore, writing the inscription linking himself to Holden Caulfield inside the cover. By mid-afternoon, he was back at his post outside the Dakota. Around 4:00 p.m., a limousine pulled up to the curb. John Lennon and Yoko Ono emerged from the building's archway, heading to a recording session at the Record Plant Studio to work on a new track called Walking on Thin Ice. As Lennon walked toward the car, Chapman stepped forward. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his hand was steady. He didn't pull the gun. Instead, he held out a copy of the Double Fantasy album and a pen. Lennon stopped. He was famously approachable, always willing to sign autographs for the fans who waited outside his home. He took the album from Chapman and signed his name across the cover, John Lennon, December 1980. Lennon looked up, his famous wire-rimmed glasses catching the afternoon light. He looked directly into the eyes of his killer. "Is that all you want?" Lennon asked politely. Chapman, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer presence of the man, could only nod. "Yes, thanks, John." Paul Gauche, the photographer standing nearby, snapped a photograph of this encounter. It is an image that remains deeply haunting to this day. John Lennon, focused on signing the record, his face illuminated by a gentle light, while next to him, the soft-featured profile of Mark David Chapman stares down at the album, his expression an inscrutable mix of reverence and malice. The limousine pulled away, leaving Chapman on the sidewalk. He had achieved what thousands of fans dreamed of, a personal, peaceful encounter with John Lennon. He had an autographed record in his hands, but it wasn't enough. The signature didn't validate Chapman's existence. It only proved that Lennon was real and that he was accessible. The trap remained set. The midnight hour. For the next several hours, Chapman waited. The temperature dropped significantly as night fell. Paul Gauche left, offering to give Chapman a ride or a place to warm up, but Chapman refused, stating that he was going to wait for Lennon to return. At approximately 10:50 p.m., the Lennons' limousine returned to West 72nd Street. Instead of pulling inside the secure courtyard of the Dakota, which the driver normally did, the car parked at the curb outside the gates. Lennon and Ono got out of the vehicle, intending to walk through the archway to grab a bite to eat inside their apartment before going to bed. Yoko Ono walked a few paces ahead. John Lennon followed closely behind, carrying several cassette tapes from the recording session. As Lennon entered the shadow of the archway, he glanced toward Chapman, possibly recognizing the man who had asked for an autograph 6 hours earlier. He kept walking. Chapman waited until Lennon had passed him by a few steps, his back turned. He didn't call out Lennon's name, despite early erroneous media reports claiming he yelled, "Mr. Lennon." Chapman later confirmed that he spoke no words. He took a deliberate step back into a combat stance, reached into his heavy coat, and drew the Charter Arms .38 revolver. He leveled the weapon at the center of John Lennon's back. The first shot. The bullet struck Lennon in the back, missing his spine but tearing into his left shoulder. The second shot. The third shot. The fourth shot. In rapid succession, 4 of the 5 hollow-point bullets struck Lennon's body. 2 bullets entered the left side of his back, passing through his lungs and severing his left subclavian artery, the main blood vessel supplying the arm and upper body. Another bullet struck his left shoulder. The force of the impacts shattered Lennon's bones and tore through his internal organs. Lennon staggered forward up the short flight of stairs into the Dakota's reception office, dropping the cassette tapes. He gasped his final coherent words to the night manager, Jay Hastings, "I'm shot, I'm shot." He then collapsed face down onto the floor, blood pouring from his mouth and chest. The madness in the cold. Outside, under the archway, the world dissolved into chaos. Jose Perdomo, the doorman, rushed forward, sobbing with shock and grief. He looked at Chapman, who was standing calmly, the smoking gun dangling from his right hand. Perdomo screamed at him, "Do you know what you've done? Do you know what you just did?" Chapman looked at him with an eerie, detached serenity. "Yes," he replied softly, "I just shot John Lennon." Chapman didn't run. He didn't try to escape into the dark expanse of Central Park just across the street. He didn't turn the gun on himself. Instead, he calmly unloaded the remaining ammunition from the revolver, dropped the weapon onto the cold pavement, and removed his heavy coat, standing in his shirt sleeves in the freezing December air. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his copy of The Catcher in the Rye, sat down on the curb under the street lamp, and began to read. When the first police officers arrived on the scene minutes later, their guns drawn and screaming orders, they found Chapman exactly like that. A solitary figure reading a paperback novel next to a pool of blood and a discarded firearm. Officer Herb Fraunberger ordered Chapman to the ground, handcuffed him, and searched him. Chapman offered no resistance. He looked up at the officer and said, "Don't hurt me, I'm harmless. I'm the catcher in the rye." Meanwhile, Officer Tony Palmer and Officer Jim Moran lifted the shattered, bleeding body of John Lennon into the back of their police cruiser. Realizing that there was no time to wait for an ambulance, they sped through the streets of Manhattan toward St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital Center, their sirens wailing into the night. In the back of the car, Moran looked down at the rock star. "Are you John Lennon?" he asked, desperately trying to keep the man conscious. Lennon could only manage a faint, guttural groan before losing consciousness permanently. At 11:15 p.m., in the emergency room of Roosevelt Hospital, Dr. Lynn Stephan and a team of surgeons opened Lennon's chest, attempting to stop the massive internal bleeding. They massaged his heart manually, but the damage caused by Chapman's hollow-point bullets was catastrophic. Lennon had lost nearly 80% of his blood volume before even reaching the hospital. The heart would not beat again. John Lennon was pronounced dead. Act 5, The Legacy of a Void. The news of John Lennon's assassination hit the world like an earthquake. Within hours, thousands of people converged on the sidewalk outside the Dakota, weeping, lighting candles, and singing Lennon's songs into the night sky. The grief was global, a collective trauma that defined the end of an era. And inside a cold interrogation room at the 20th Precinct, David Chapman sat, completely insulated from the grief he had caused. He was ecstatic. During his initial police interviews, Chapman was cooperative, polite, and deeply eager to explain his philosophy. He told detectives that he had acted on behalf of Holden Caulfield, that he was the living embodiment of the novel's protagonist. He believed that the murder was an artistic and philosophical masterpiece, an act of supreme truth that would shake humanity out of its phoniness. The trial that wasn't. As the months rolled toward his trial in 1981, Chapman was subjected to dozens of psychiatric evaluations. The legal teams prepared for a massive, high-profile insanity defense. Multiple defense psychologists diagnosed Chapman with various forms of schizophrenia and severe delusional disorders, arguing that he was completely incapable of understanding the reality of his actions at the time of the shooting. The prosecution countered, arguing that while Chapman was undoubtedly mentally ill, his planning was meticulous, his execution deliberate, and he fully understood that murder was unlawful. Then, in June 1981, Chapman threw another wrench into the machinery of justice. He announced to his defense attorney, Jonathan Marks, that he wished to drop his insanity defense and plead guilty to first-degree murder. Marks and the psychiatric experts were horrified, believing that this decision was itself a product of Chapman's delusions. Chapman claimed that God had visited him in his prison cell at Rikers Island and told him to plead guilty. Despite his lawyers' strenuous objections and attempts to have him declared legally incompetent to make such a plea, Judge Dennis Edwards accepted Chapman's guilty decision. On August 24, 1981, David Chapman stood before the court for sentencing. When asked if he had anything to say, he didn't offer an apology. He didn't speak of John Lennon. Instead, he stood up, opened his copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and read aloud a passage from Chapter 22, the famous monologue where Holden Caulfield describes his dream of standing at the edge of a cliff, catching children before they fall into the abyss. Anyway, I keep picturing all these little kids playing some game in this big field of rye and all. Thousands of little kids, and nobody's around, nobody big, I mean, except me. And I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. I mean, if they're running and they don't look where they're going, I have to come out from somewhere and catch them. That's all I do all day. I'd just be the catcher in the rye and all. Judge Edwards sentenced Chapman to a prison term of 20 years to life, a sentence that meant he would remain behind bars until at least the year 2000, after which he would be eligible for parole every 2 years. The Endless Silhouette. David Chapman was sent to Attica Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in upstate New York. For decades, he lived in protective custody, kept away from the general prison population for his own safety. Many inmates, seeking their own distorted path to fame, openly threatened to murder the man who killed John Lennon. As the years ground into decades, the romanticized literary delusions that had fueled Chapman's youth began to fade, replaced by a stark, ugly reality. In his periodic parole hearings, which began in the year 2000, a different version of Chapman began to emerge, one that stripped away the Holden Caulfield facade to reveal the pathetic truth of the crime. During his 2020 parole hearing, 40 years after the murder, Chapman spoke with a bluntness that offered no comfort, only clarity. He admitted that his actions were driven entirely by a desperate, narcissistic thirst for self-importance. "I knew what I was doing, and I knew it was evil," Chapman told the parole board. "I knew it was wrong, but I wanted the fame so bad that I was willing to give everything and take a human life. I'm not going to blame anything else or anybody else for bringing me there. It was my choice. I wanted to be somebody, and nothing was going to stop that. He added, in a moment of bitter self-awareness, I isolated myself from the real world. I chose a book over reality. I chose a gun over a life. I wanted to be a big name, but instead, I became a symbol of a void. As of 2026, Mark David Chapman remains incarcerated at Green Haven Correctional Facility in Stormville, New York. He has been denied parole more than a dozen times. Each time, the parole boards cite the same fundamental truth. His release would depreciate the seriousness of the crime, undermine respect for the law, and provoke a high probability of public violence. The tragedy of December 8, 1980, did not achieve what Chapman's shattered mind intended. He didn't catch the children in the rye. He didn't cure the world of phoniness. He merely tore a hole in the fabric of cultural history, silencing a voice that preached peace and replacing it with the sharp, meaningless crack of gunfire. John Lennon's legacy continues to echo through generations, his music surviving the passage of time. Mark David Chapman remains what he always feared he would be, a shadow trapped inside a stone wall, remembered not for who he was, but for the beautiful thing he chose to destroy. If you found this deep dive into the psychological anatomy of this tragedy compelling, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments below what you thought. Thanks for watching.